If I mention that god-awful eyesore in the centre of Beckham Rise, you know, the convenience store with all glass and car parks and all of that, horrible looking place, you'll know exactly where I mean, don't you? Yes. Well, before that, there was a beautiful timber frame building that was an old grocery shop. Well, it was more of a bit of everything shop, really, because you could go in there and you could buy a loaf of bread or a pot of jam. You could even get a watering can or a light bulb. Old Philpots used to sell everything. And he ran it with his son Johnny, who was about 10. And Johnny would go and do all the deliveries. People would phone in on the old telephone, phone in their orders, and Johnny would deliver it on his butcher's bike. You know the sort of thing, one of those big heavy iron bikes with the basket at the front, the sort of advertising hoarding in the centre of the frame. And he would pedal around and get all the orders done. And the phone call would come in with an order from somebody, and Mr. Philpot would make a list of everything that was required on a piece of paper, gather it all up, put it into a string bag, put the address on an envelope of the customer, put the piece of paper into the envelope and give it to Johnny. And then Johnny would go and make the delivery. And that was the normal procedure, and it worked really well. Well, one day, when the shop was particularly busy, there was an urgent phone call from the squire. Now, the squire lived in this large Victorian villa about 3/4 of a mile just outside the village. Everybody knew the squire, and he was a very important customer. And ordinarily, Mr. Philpot would go and sort him out, giving him the personal touch, taking everything in his van. But on this particular day, there was a lot of people in there, and it was an urgent call, and he couldn't go. So he said to Johnny, look, I'm going to let you go and do this one, but you'll have to be on your best behaviour. So he got all the items together, wrote them down on the piece of paper, put the address on the envelope, even though Johnny knew exactly where it was, gave him the envelope with the paper inside and gave him the string bag with all the items. And Johnny bunged it into the basket and pedalled off to the villa. Didn't take him long because he knew the way. And when he arrived, there were two boys loafing about on the gravel driveway, and they saw him. They were the squire's sons. They saw him and they said, "Oi, what do you want?" And little Johnny said, "Well, I'm here to deliver what the squire wanted from the shop." "Oh, you're from Philpot's." And they saw the emblazoned hoarding on the bike. "Oh yes, that's all right. You'll have to go in the tradesman's entrance," they said. "That's all right," said Johnny. He was used to going round the back of people's houses. So he went in and he delivered all the items, ticked them off on the piece of paper, and everything was fine. But when he came back to pick up his bicycle, these two boys were inspecting it and looking at it with very much interest. Anyway, as he was going to collect his bike, the boy said, "Here, just a minute. Would you like to earn 10 shillings? And little Johnny thought to himself, what? 10 shillings? That's a lot of money. It was a lot of money for a 10-year-old boy back then. He said, "What have I got to do?" And they said, "Well, we'll have a wager with you. You see that hedge over there?" And he looked at the hedge and he said, "That's the Beckham Maze." Well, everybody knew the Beckham Maze. It was quite famous in the area. And he said, "Yes." He said, "In the middle of the Beckham Maze is an apple tree." And he said, "Yes, I can see the apple." You could just see the apple tree poking up with its branches. And he said, "Beside the apple tree is a plinth, and on the plinth is a small statue of Pan with his pipes." And they said, "Yes." He said, "If you can get into the maze, find the centre and bring back the statue, we'll give you 10 shillings. Little Johnny thought, well, that's all right. He said, "But if you fail to do it, we'll have the bike." And Johnny thought, well, it can't be that difficult. So he said, "All right then." So he was about to go and he said, "Hang on a minute. Is it all right if I cycle in the maze? I don't want to be late for my dad and it'll do it much quicker." And the boys looked at themselves thinking, well, that'll be all right. "Yeah, no, that's fine." He said, "But what you can't do is you can't go through the hedge because the hedge is too thick. No one could go through the hedge. It was known to be a very thick hedge." He says, "You can't bury under because the roots are too deep, and you mustn't climb over the top." He said, "To make sure you don't do that, me and my brother are going to be sitting on these step ladders and we're going to be watching." Now, they couldn't see into the maze, but they could certainly see over the top to see if there was any cheating going on. So little Johnny said, "Yeah, all right then." So he got on his bike and he disappeared into the maze, pedalling round. Well, of course, luckily, thanks to having the apple tree in the centre, it didn't take him too long to fathom out where it was. And it was much speedier on his bike. But the two boys on the step ladders were grinning to themselves, because what he hadn't told little Johnny was the apple tree, the plinth and the statue of Pan was surrounded by another thick hedge with one gap in it, which was barred by a metal gate, padlocked. There was no way in. Now the gate was low enough to the ground that you couldn't get underneath, and it was high enough that you couldn't get over it without being seen. Anyway, they were laughing to themselves, thinking that they were going to have this bike very soon. But a few moments later, little Johnny came cycling out, clutching the statue of Pan. And the boys looked at themselves and thought, hello, how did that happen? Little Johnny goes up to them and says, can I have that 10 shillings note now, please? I've got the statue. And they said, hang on, just a minute. You can't have the note until you tell us how it was done. And little Johnny said, oh, well, that was easy. You just made a couple of mistakes, that was all. What do you mean? He said, well, the first mistake was telling me the centre of the statue was but where the apple tree was. Oh, everybody knows that's where the centre of the tree is. That's not a mistake. All right, said Johnny. The second mistake was letting me go in on my bicycle. Why is that a mistake? And he said, well, you didn't tell me about the gate and the hedge, so I couldn't get through in the normal way. I had to think of something else. So, he said, what I realised was I could see through the little hole where the padlock is in the gate to see where the plinth was and where the statue was. And I realised that I could do something. So what I did is I undid the hoarding on my bike from the centre frame using my puncture repair kit, a spanner from there. And as I put that on the ground, I unravelled from my string bag enough of the string to make a nice one piece of string. Yeah. I tied that using a hole in the hoarding where the bolt would normally fix it to the bike, so I could have it on a string. And I kicked it underneath the gate, because there was just enough room to do that, on one side of the plinth. Right, said the boys. Well, because it's autumn and there are apples on the trees and many of them have fallen, on the ground were plenty of nice sized apples. So I picked up an appropriate one that I could hold in my hand and still get through the little hole in the gate. And I was able to throw that at an angle that knocked the statue onto the hoarding. And then I could pull the hoarding back with a piece of string. And here it is. And they said, well, hang on a minute. You still couldn't get it underneath the gate because the statue was too big. How did you do that? And little Johnny said, well, that's for me to know and you to find out. I've told you everything else, now give me the money. And they said, listen, if we give you another 10 shillings, can you do it again? And little Johnny thought, well, yeah, of course I could, thinking suddenly he was going to be rich. So they said, right, okay, well, one of the boys went off to reset the statue and everything else, and he came back and he said, but this time we want you to do it without your bicycle, without your string bag and the hoarding and your bicycle repair kit and all of that nonsense. So little Johnny thought about this and he said, and you'll give me 10 shillings. I want the first 10 shillings now, and then I'll do it, and then you can give me the second 10 shillings when I come back. He was a very astute little boy, this. So they said, yeah, all right then, but if you don't, we'll have the money back and we keep the bike. Deal. So little Johnny wandered off and the two boys got back up onto the step ladder and they were waiting and peering. And a few minutes later, little Johnny appeared, bright big as bold, with the statue in his hand. And the boys scratched their heads again and they thought, hang on a minute, his bike's over here. He couldn't have done the same trick. So they said, how did you do it? He said, I'm not telling you until you give me the money. So they gave him the money and he said, well, actually it's for you to find out and me to know. And the boys were a bit miffed and he says, if you don't let me go, I'm going to tell your dad that you're not being sportsmen. So the boys didn't want to be told off like that. So they said, oh, go on then, having lost 20 shillings now. Anyway, little Johnny got on his bike and cycled back to the shop, full of himself and very happy, as you can imagine. When he got back to the shop, all was quiet in the shop now, and everything had settled down, and his dad was putting a few extra bits and pieces away, and Johnny came in and he put his bike down, and he was very happy. And his dad, Mr. Philpot, said, "Everything all right then there, Johnny?" And Johnny was full of him, so he said, "Yes, oh, everything's absolutely fine, Dad." And he put down the envelope on the desk, and Mr. Philpot took out the list and checked that all the ticks, that everything had been given to the squire and everything was fine. And as he did that, he picked up the envelope to throw it away, and he realised there was an object inside it. And he thought, that's odd. He opened it up and he took the object out and he said, "Oh, you've left this in the envelope. I thought you were going to give it to the squire." And he said, "Why didn't you?" And little Johnny looked up and he said, "Well, it wasn't on the list." "Oh," he said, "I'd forgotten and put it in the envelope at the very last minute, because the squire came in last week and he bought this lovely new padlock for his garden. And of course I forgot to give him the spare key." "Oh, well, never mind." And Johnny smiled a wry smile and skipped out into the lovely noonday sun. What a lovely story, eh?